Okay, friends, welcome back to another video. In the last couple of videos, we covered the law of demand and the law of supply. Today, in this video, we're going to bring those two together into a market. Remember, a market is composed of buyers and sellers. We now know that buyers, that's the law of demand, and sellers, that's the law of supply. So when we bring that supply curve and that demand curve together, in this graph, in this model, we're building a market, okay? So the supply and demand model, as you know, brings buyers, represented by the demand curve, and sellers with the supply curve together. That's what we're gonna do today in this video, okay? Let's start off with the idea of market equilibrium, okay? Market equilibrium basically is the point where supply and demand come together. Market equilibrium occurs at the one point on a graph where supply intercepts or meets demand. You can see right here, we've got our graph, we've got our axis here labeled with price, our axis here labeled with quantity. We have our supply curve upward sloping, as we know, and our demand curve. And this point right here, where those two come together, that is our market equilibrium, okay? Let's talk about that a little bit more. Let me first clean this up. We're going to come back to it. Okay, let's go back up here. So market equilibrium occurs where supply equals demand. Critically, this market equilibrium point determines two big ideas, two big values, two big concepts. The market equilibrium point determines the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price in that market. We asked this question a while back. Well, we know what prices are. We know prices are important, but how are prices determined? In a competitive market, prices are determined at equilibrium, which is another way of saying that at the end of it all, in a competitive market, prices simply reflect the incentives and actions of buyers and the incentives and actions of sellers coming together. Because again, supply and demand coming together give us equilibrium, and equilibrium gives us the equilibrium price. So it's a really important thing to get your head around. You know, a lot of people, they think that prices have this kind of control function and people just kind of make them up or whatever. It's not really the case. Really, from an economic lens, in a competitive market, prices reflect the decisions of millions and millions of suppliers and millions of demanders coming together in markets. And that's why this model is so powerful. Okay, so again, market equilibrium occurs at the one point where supply equals demand, and that point gives us the equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price. At equilibrium, here's the key: the market price is such that the quantity that buyers want to buy exactly equals the quantity that sellers want to sell. And the market, therefore, is in balance, or we say the market clears. Okay, it works out like this. You have this again, market, our axes, P and Q, price here, quantity here, supply upward sloping, demand downward sloping. The point where supply equals demand, that is the market equilibrium point. And that point is where, as we said a minute ago, supply equals demand, which means that it's also an efficient point, because by making supply equal demand, it means that in that market, every seller finds a buyer, every potential buyer finds a seller, the market clears. There's no wasted resources. If we take this equilibrium point and we do a dotted line across, this gives us the equilibrium price. And that is the price that prevails in a competitive market. Okay, the equilibrium price that prevails in a competitive market is simply the price at the equilibrium point. And if we drop a line straight down, we would get down here the equilibrium quantity. So it's really important to think supply and demand come together to form the equilibrium point, the clearing point where supply equals demand. From there, we can go across to get the equilibrium price that prevails in the market. This is how much items in that market will sell for, and we get the equilibrium quantity, which tells us how many items will be bought and sold. So the equilibrium point is really important, but that leads to another question. How do we get there? You know, the reality is markets don't just emerge at equilibrium. In fact, if you really wanted to be, really precise about it, no competitive market ever really hits its equilibrium. Instead, in economics, we say that markets tend to move toward equilibrium. But of course, markets always change and buyer behavior and seller behavior changes. And as that changes, the dynamics of the market change, which we'll discuss in a later video. But for now, just understand that equilibrium is an important point and that markets, even if they never hit equilibrium, they tend to move toward it. And that happens through a process that we're going to call the equilibrium, the equilibrium adjustment process. The equilibrium adjustment process is the process that takes place in competitive markets where, and not without government involvement, but simply by the private actions of individual buyers and sellers pursuing their own selfish incentives and self-interest. Again, in a competitive market, individual buyers and sellers pursuing their own selfish interests, their own self-guided rational behaviors, engage in this equilibrium adjustment process that will over time move the market toward equilibrium. And the equilibrium adjustment process does this by weeding out conditions of surplus and shortage. We can think, if you want to be really fancy to justify the high LMU tuition you're paying, you can think of surplus and shortage as conditions that we can call disequilibria. They're not in equilibrium, surplus and shortage. Let's talk about those briefly. A price that is too high will lead to a surplus. So a surplus is a condition that arises when the going market price is above what that market's equilibrium price is. A surplus can also be seen as an excess of quantity supplied over quantity demanded. So a surplus occurs when quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded, or we'll call this excess supply. Now you have to think from the point of view of a business, excess supply is not a good thing. Businesses don't make money by letting stuff sit on shelves. They have to sell it. And excess supply can be especially dangerous for a business if the item in question, let's say, is a technology good or a food good that can either become obsolete or just become rotten very quickly. Also think about it from the point of view of the producer. Cost of production. Anytime a producer has made an item, they've already spent money to buy land, labor, and capital resources. They've expended money to buy the materials to make this good. If you spend lots of money and don't sell the products, you're going to go bankrupt soon. You're not going to survive with money going out, and no money coming in. And as a result of that, sellers, again, not acting because the government told them to, not acting to be nice, but out of their own selfish, self-interested behavior, if there's an excess supply, sellers are going to react by lowering prices, getting them from that too high point down toward a more stable equilibrium point. It's going to look like this. Let's start off with what equilibrium is. Let's just say that hypothetically the equilibrium price in this market is $10. Let's say that sellers don't know that, so they're selling at a price of $12. Well, if we draw a line across here, we can see, and we would predict this because people respond to incentives, that at a high price, the quantity supplied is going to exceed the quantity demanded. That makes sense, right? Think about the law of supply, law of demand. Law of supply says high prices, there's an incentive to supply more. So when the price is, a little bit higher than it should be, the quantity supplied, let me get rid of this real quick. When the price is too high, the quantity supplied will be larger than the quantity demanded because sellers are incentivized to produce more at a high price while buyers are incentivized to purchase less. And that gap right there between the high QS and the low QD, that, my friends, is our surplus. But companies can't last if they have surpluses. So out of their own selfish interests, sellers will reduce their prices. And the process of reducing those prices will reduce that surplus. Because as prices go down, the quantity supplied will go down, the quantity demanded will go up, and we will move toward equilibrium. Okay? Let's take another case, the opposite disequilibrium case. This is a case called shortage. A shortage occurs when the price is, shall we say, too low relative to equilibrium. And when you have a shortage, you effectively have an excess of quantity demanded over quantity supplied. In other words, you have an excess demand. Now put yourself in the position of a seller. You're selling items. You don't really know what the market price should be, so you just set a price, kind of an arbitrary price. If you realize that you're selling out of items, that at that particular price, your product is so popular that there's like lines out the door, what's going to be your rational decision, your rational incentive-based choice as a seller? And it's simple. You're going to raise your prices. Why? Because you can. Because the market has an excess demand for your good. So you can raise those prices. In this case, the actions of buyers and sellers will cause prices to increase. Note again the critical idea here that the prices are not changing because government dictated that they change or because some central planning bureau says, hey, that price is wrong, fix it. It's the messy, chaotic market made up of the decisions of millions and millions of sellers and millions of buyers, all looking out for their own rational self-interest that generates this outcome. Let's do a real quick example here. Let's again start off. Let's say again that the market equilibrium, which the seller did not know, was at a price of $10. The seller decides, because he doesn't know what the market equilibrium price is, he sets a price at $7. Well, you can guess what's going to happen. Think about the law of supply, the law of demand, and what they say guide incentives. At an artificially or excessively low price, the quantity supplied will be very low because low prices tell sellers sell less. But at this low price, the quantity demanded will be very high because buyers love low prices. So when we're not at equilibria, we're going to have a condition where, in this case, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. That's going to be our shortage. And a profit-minded entrepreneur will then react by raising prices, by moving them toward equilibrium. Notice what happens when he changes prices. The reactions based on the law of supply and the law of demand and all those incentives are predictable. As the prices go up, sellers will increase their output. at the same time that buyers buy less. And both of those forces converge again to move us back toward that economic happy spot called equilibrium. Okay, let's wrap this up by noting that equilibrium is a really important point. It's like the happy point in economic market theory. It's a happy point because it maximizes efficiency. We'll learn later it maximizes social welfare. There's no excess, there's no shortage. The market clears and it's just efficient and it works. The beauty of the market, or I should say the beauty of the competitive market, is that we don't need in a competitive market some centralized planning board or some commie dictatorship telling us what prices to charge. The competitive market and the rational self-interested choices that buyers and sellers make will naturally move to eliminate shortages, eliminate surpluses, and move prices toward equilibrium. And that's the beauty of a market economy. I'm not going to go so far right now as to say that it's self-regulating, but there are mechanisms built into place that keep the market economy more efficient than other forms of economic organization. Okay. The final thing I do want to point out, though, is just simply to make the point that equilibrium, while efficient, that does not mean that everybody is necessarily happy. You know, in this case here, the equilibrium price was $10. Obviously, sellers would have loved to have charged more. Buyers would have loved to have paid less. And imagine that you're talking about, let's say that this was an essential item like rent or food. And if the equilibrium price was $10 and a person only had $5, that person is going to be priced out of a food market and starve, or priced out of a housing market and be homeless. So it's important to recognize, again, that while equilibrium is an efficiency point, it does not necessarily guarantee that all market players are going to be happy. But again, until we can find an alternative system that satisfies that, we have to conclude that competitive markets and the market adjustment process leads to the best possible outputs in a condition of scarce resources and scarce information. Okay, so at this point now, my friends, we know markets in context. We know about the law of supply, the law of demand. In this video, we brought them together to make a market. And we've learned that surpluses and shortages will naturally be weeded out of the system and move markets continually, perpetually, slowly but surely toward equilibrium. In our next video, we're going to go back to the demand curve and see how the demand curve can change and how those demand changes, which we're going to call demand shifts, can affect the market. Okay, talk to you soon. Thank you. Take care.